This time we'll look at 5 of the worst Grand Prix bikes ever built. They say that motorcycle racing is the toughest test of man and machine, but even the biggest companies sometimes get it wrong. Here are 5 of the worst motorcycle Grand Prix bikes ever built. BSA's 1921 TT bike. BSA have never really been into Grand Prix racing. However, in 1921 they decided to have a tilt at the TT, and they built an all-new overhead valve engine because they believed that side valves were a thing of the past, and put it in a chassis that owed more than a nod to a Scott chassis. They took the bikes there, determined that they were going to win the TT. However, this did not happen. In fact, not one of their machines actually finished the race. Ironically, it was a side valve engine which did win the race, and it was the last time that a side valve would do so. BSA management were furious. They ordered that the bikes be left behind in the Isle of Man and never be spoken of again. BSA themselves did not go racing again for several years. Now, although there are a few of the chassis left remaining, only one complete bike actually exists at the moment, although others may be later restored. The Honda NR500. Honda had successfully campaigned in Grand Prix racing into the 1960s, but in 1968 they'd withdrawn. However, in the late 70s they decided to return. But they weren't going to build a 2-stroke like everybody else, Honda being primarily a 4-stroke company. They reasoned that if they could build a 4-stroke that could rev twice as high as the 2-stroke racers, then they'd be equal on power. So what they needed to develop was an engine that could rev to around 20,000 RPM if it was going to be competitive in terms of horsepower against the rest of the 2-stroke field. To do this was extremely difficult because they were limited to 4 cylinders. So to sidestep the cylinder limit, they built a bike with oval pistons. In effect, they sort of built something between a V8 and a V4 by using oval pistons instead of round pistons. That way they could fit multiple valves into a single, somewhat oval, as the name implies, cylinder. The resulting engine could rev extremely highly, but it wasn't high enough. Initially the engine was only making just over 100 horsepower, whereas most of the Grand Prix competition was making over 120 at that point. The engine would eventually reach its full 120 horsepower or thereabouts potential at the aimed 20,000 RPM, but it simply wasn't enough. The chassis wasn't really up to the job, and ultimately the 4-stroke engine was just too darn heavy when compared to the much lighter and equally, if not more powerful 2-strokes. In the end, Honda gave up and built their V3 2-stroke, and it was the backup plan which would eventually bring them Grand Prix success, with Freddie Spencer taking the World Championship. The NR was quietly moved aside. A road version, the limited edition NR 750, was produced for a short time and was eye-wateringly expensive. But ultimately, it was a technology that really wasn't particularly useful in road machines, being just too darn expensive to mass produce. However, a number of technologies that were developed for the program did find their way onto Honda road bikes. The NR500 did not win any Grand Prix and can only really be judged as a failure. The Motogutsu V8. The Motogutsu V8 is a machine that pains me to include really because it is the most technically sophisticated motorcycle ever used in Grand Prix. I mean, 8 cylinders, water cooling, and what by the standards of the time for a 500 4-stroke, phenomenal amounts of power. However, it was that old story again. The engine was too powerful for the chassis, and this made the thing evil handling. In fact, in many cases, lethal handling. Also, Moto Guzzi were really pushing the limits of what was possible back then. The engine was mighty and powerful, but it was also heavy, and it was very difficult to get the thing firing. Trying to work out how to fit 8 tiny carburetors and get them all running smoothly was incredibly difficult. And don't even think about the ignition system because there was no electronic ignition back then. So it was all done on points, meaning that reliability was always going to be a problem. Forgetting the main mechanical part, just to try and get the carburetors to work properly and the ignition system to work was a challenge that was almost impossible to overcome. Should Moto Guzzi have built a 4 like everyone else? It's difficult to say. It's an incredible achievement that they even got the bike running. Unfortunately, it didn't win any Grand Prix. What it really got a reputation for at the time, unfortunately, was either killing or seriously injuring the people that rode it. By the end of 1957, Moto Guzzi had almost no riders left who were prepared to take the thing out into a Grand Prix. Also, the bike was incredibly expensive to run, and in 1957, Moto Guzzi would withdraw from Grand Prix racing for good. The machine would go on to set a number of speed records, but would never actually win a single Grand Prix. The Jawa V4 350. Jawa is a company which is better known today for making fairly humble parallel twin two-strokes, or rather less humble and indeed very successful speedway engines. People have largely forgotten that they did have some success in Grand Prix racing. Their early machines were 4-stroke parallel twins. However, in the late 60s, they developed a 350cc V4 two-stroke. The machine was liquid cooled and ran disc valves and was extraordinarily powerful. The chassis was excellent and the brakes were excellent. It really did show the future of Grand Prix racing and was beginning to catch up with the MVs. Unfortunately, the machine was simply not reliable. Jawa, to their credit, did the best they could, but they didn't have the finances to really develop such a high-tech machine. The machine developed a terrible reputation for seizing and throwing its rider into the weeds. This would lead to tragic consequences when British racer Bill Ivy, shortly after having finished second in the previous Grand Prix, was killed at the Saxonry when the machine seized, locked up and threw him into the bales. Bill Ivy's head unfortunately struck a post, his helmet having been thrown off in the accident, and died of his head injuries. The Jawa is unfortunately something of a missed opportunity. It could have been very successful had Jawa been able to make the machine more reliable, but they simply didn't have the finances to develop the machine fully, and again it was a machine that simply did not achieve the success that it should have done. The Honda NSR 500, 1988 edition. If the Honda NSR 500 in 1988 was a Genesis song, it would be Throwing It All Away. In 1987, Honda dominated Grand Prix racing, and Wayne Gardner had won the World Championship. In 1988, they brought along some of their engineers who had worked on the Formula 1 cars, thinking that this would actually add to the technology and make the machine even more dominant. What the engineers did was concentrated the mass of the bike lower down than they had done previously. Now, although this may work really well in cars, it doesn't really help in bikes, because in bikes sometimes you need some of the weight a little bit higher if you're going to get the machine to tip into corners. Unfortunately, with the weight down a little bit lower, the bike simply didn't turn as well. To compound this, the suspension setup was much stiffer, the chassis was stiffer, and so that didn't have any flex in it either, and the engine was much peakier. What all this meant was the bike was very fast in a straight line, didn't really like the corners too much, and on tighter and more flowing circuits it really did struggle. On fast circuits, the bike's incredible power did pay dividends, and in fact the machine did win 3 Grand Prix that season. It also succeeded, however, in throwing its riders into the dirt a few times and in being completely uncompetitive on many of the more tricky circuits. As a result, Wayne Gardner would finish second in the World Championship, which isn't a bad result. It should have been so much better. The previous year's bike was actually better than the new 88 model. So this is definitely one of those cases of Honda being that little bit too clever, perhaps for their own good. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, thank you very much for watching.